A very good morning to my dear students. Now, today we would be talking about development of law of evidence in India, which is a very important topic under Indian legal and constitutional history. Now, if we talk about evidence, which is also known as sakshi, and many a times we in our general talks also we say, okay, this has happened, okay, what is the evidence of it, what is the proof of it that it has happened? So we always base our judgment on some evidences or some proof in in general life also. So this law is very important. And now when we talk about Indian Evidence Act, which is currently we are prevalent in India, it is passed by British Parliament. So this act, like in my previous PPT I told you about Indian Contract Act and its development. So you see, the Indian Evidence Act is also colonial in nature. It was passed by Britishers, and it contains a set of rules and regulation regarding admissibility of evidence in the court of law. Admissibility of evidence means what are the evidence which are acceptable, who can make those evidences, who are the people who are exempted from giving evidences, then self-incriminating evidences, and all those evidences. If you might not have studied Evidence Act as of now, but when you would be studying Evidence Act, you would get to know that what all is there in the evidence law. Now, when we talk about the provisions in Indian Evidence Act, now these provisions speak about both procedure and rights. So, if you know that there are two kinds of law, one is the procedural law, another one is the substantive law, right? Procedural and substantive. Now, if we talk about substantive law, we always say it defines crime, and procedural law prescribes the procedure for when when the crime is committed, with the entire procedure with respect to that crime is related in the procedural law. Now when, as far as defining crime and its punishment is there, it's the concern of substantive law. Now, when we talk about Indian Evidence Act, it specifies right as well as it is specifying the procedure. So to call it purely substantive would be wrong, or to call it purely procedure would be wrong. So we use the term subjective, that this is a subjective law, because it defines both procedure as well as right. It provides procedures to how to proceed to the court of law, or how to establish our claim before the court. Now, when you have to study the development of Indian Evidence Act, now the development of Indian Evidence Act has to be looked into different time frames. Now, we would be studying about Hindu period, followed by Muslim period, then British period, and then the post-independence period. Now, moving ahead to the Hindu period. So, the law of evidence in ancient India, that is the Hindu period. Now, in ancient India, when we talk about ancient India, we know that there was a king, Raja, who used to be the judge and provide justice to the aggrieved person, who was the Praja. So Raja providing justice to the Praja, that was the general concept. So the evidence and anything that has to be taken, the power was vested with the king, that is the Raja. And the Praja would give evidence to the king, who would based on those evidences, he would pass the final decree. So in ancient India, as it is written in the PPT also, you can see the Hindu period. In the Hindu period, there was one court which is known as Sasista, and this was the court which was presided by a king, and king was vested with the power of passing the final decree. Also, these courts were not bounded by any technical procedure. So there was no technical procedure that we see in in present time. There are a lot of technicalities. You have to give evidence, you have to give notice to the court, a lot of other things are there, but that time there was no technical procedure, and that the aggrieved person has to follow. The only consideration during the ancient India, which we would be seeing later on also, was upholding the dharma. And how do we define dharma? There is no particular act that defines dharma. Dharma would, mean different thing to a different community. For example, for Hindu, dharma would be something else. For Muslim, dharma may be something else. So dharma depends on different religious community that was prevalent. And India had been a secular country, since time immemorial. So we have a lot of religion in India, a lot of religious community in India. So dharma for every religious community would be different. But the only purpose of the king was to uphold the dharma. Now, when we talk about, when the trial was conducted in the, court which was presided by the king, now with the help of witnesses and documents that were given by the parties to support the claim, king used to, examine the witness without delay, and he would examine the witness who are present and should consider along with the members of the court the statement made by them. So all the statement made by the witness would be admissible and would be examined by the king himself without any delay. Now, one thing is very important. How is the evidence taken? Now, this is very important, in your day-to-day life also, those, who do some, puja at their home, they know it, that, in at today's time also, whenever you're going for any, puja under Hindu law, one thing that is very common is, there would be a, sacred grass that's known as kusha, and, the cow dung is also there in the, puja ceremony. Then there would be Ganga Jal, and, so all these things were there, and, is present today also. But when we go back to that time, the ancient India, now before taking evidence, the one thing that they have to do was to take off their shoes, and then the turban. Okay, shoes and the turban had to be taken out, and then he would stretch out his right hand and declare the truth. How do he do that? By taking one of these: gold, cow dung, a few sacred grass, or as the case may be. So these are the three things specified: gold, sona, cow dung, and sacred grass, that is kush. Now, and the highest punishment that could be inflicted, during that time, for giving false evidence was capital punishment. That is taking life of the person giving false evidences. And who had the power of taking the life? It was the king. Now, if I can just take 2 minutes of yours, in my previous PPT, when I talked about contract, and I told you that, the moment, people violate contract, that means they have gone against the deity, right? And then if they have gone against the deity, that means they have, any person could take away their life because they've gone against the god. So here also, by for giving false evidence, the only punishment that could be inflicted, the highest punishment that was inflicted was the capital punishment. So now I hope it is clear. There was a king, the raja, giving justice to the praja, that is the aggrieved person. By examining the witness, the power of examination was with the king. Without any delay, he would examine the witness. He would examine the witness, and witness would administer oath after taking off his shoes and turban, stretching out his right hand, and declare the truth by taking cow dung, gold, or some sacred grass in his hand. And the highest punishment that could be inflicted for giving false evidence was the capital punishment. Now, when we talk about the religious text of ancient India or Hindu law, the first text that we talk about is Manusmriti, followed by Yajnavalk, then Narad Smriti, then Katyana Smriti, and so on and so forth. So, if we talk about Manusmriti, so according to Manu also, this is what we are talking about, Manu Smriti. According to Manu, after the parties have submitted their plaint and answers, evidence has to be presented before the court. Right? That means this is plaint and this is written statement of today's time. Even after submitting that, evidence has to be presented before the court. Clear? Now, systemizing the, rules given by Manu on the subject of evidence, Yajnavalkya was the first who mentioned about three kinds of proof. And what are these three kinds of proof? Documents, witness, and possession. So these are the three kind of proof that he's talking about: document, witness, and possession. And he adds that ordeal is another kind of evidence in absence of any of these. Now, if we talk about this ordeal, it means that you know a practice by which the guilt of innocence of the accused is determined by subjecting him to a painful task. So, if these three things could not be done, then maybe by ordeal he could, some kind of evidences could be, achieved. Then we talk about another Smriti, which was Narad's Smriti. Now, according to Narad's Smriti, he basically what he did was he amplified and explained the views of Manu and divided them into 11 classes. Also, he gave those, two major broad, headings. One was with respect to proof I'm talking about. He talked about human proof and he talked about divine proof. Human proof consists of documentary and oral evidences, and divine proof consists of ordeal by balance and the rest. So is it clear? See, if we talk about Manu Smriti or Yajnavalkya or Narad Smriti in this slide, all are talking about one and the same thing, maybe in different words. When you talk about Manu talks about taking of evidences, Then when we talk about Yajnavalkya, it talks about three kinds of proof: document, witness, and possession. Also, in absence of these, he talks about ordeal. Then when you talk about Narad Smriti, it also has classified, proof into two broad headings: human and divine. But what does human consist? Documentary and oral evidences. Divine consists of ordeal by balance and the rest. So the basis of all these are same. The genesis of laying down the law of evidence in all these three smritis that we talk about is same. And in fact, when we talk about Katyayana Smriti also, it also followed Brihaspati Upanishad and Narad Smriti, which explained the formula of 4 feet. Now, when we talk about 4 feet, what it is? It is the stages of legal proceedings. Now, what are the stages of legal proceeding? That is the 4 feet that Katyayana Smriti is talking about. One is Purva Paksh, that is the plaint. Then Uttar, that is the reply to the plaint, which today is known as written statement. Then Pratyakalita, that is deliberation as to burden of proof. And then Kriyabda, that is adducing of proof. So these are the 4 things or 4 fields that Katyayana Smriti has talked about. One is the plaint, that is the Purva Paksh, followed by Uttar, that is reply, then Pratyakalita, that is deliberation as to burden of proof, and then Kriyapada, that is adducing of proof. And only when both the parties have given their respective evidences, the court will deliver its judgment. Who was the court here? The king. The law of evidence was very well developed, but it suffered being a caste-ridden concept. Both Yajnavalkya and Katyayana prescribed 3 kinds of evidence, namely, if you talk about the, two from Yajnavalkya to Katyayana Smriti, we talk about both Yajnavalkya and Katyayana Smriti, it prescribed 3 kinds of evidence, and this is very important, students. It talked about 3 kinds of evidence. One was documents, likhita; witness, that is sakshi; and then possession, that is bhukti. Also, other means of proof consisted of reasoning, that is yukti, and ordeal, that is divyas. So, to conclude Hindu period or ancient India, we would say that the 5 law of evidences that were, the 5 kind of evidences that were prevalent during Hindu period were namely documents, that is likhita; witness, that is sakshi; possession, that is bhukti; reasoning, that is yukti, and ordeal, that is divyas. Then moving ahead to the period of Muslims or period of medieval India. Now, medieval India, we know that it was dominated by Muslim rulers, and by the since the beginning of the 12th century, Muslim king began to invade India, and the Muslim kings and emperors in medieval India established a judicial dispute resolution system according to Islamic law. Now we know that Islamic law is purely based on Holy Quran. So the conception of justice in Islam is that the administration of justice is a divine disposition. Also, there were judges who were appointed by the ruler themselves, and generally, the qazis were, preferred to decide the dispute. So there were any dispute between the parties which approached the qazi who would deliver judgment. Now, when we talk about medieval India, so during the trial, all substantive and procedural law were interpreted according to the following tenets of Quran, Sunnah, Ijma, and Qiyas. And this is very important. I'll just repeat: Quran, Sunnah, Ijma, and Qiyas. Now, before we move ahead, I would just like to quote here a few lines from the Quran, which says that, "O true believers, observe justice where you appear as witness before God, and let not hatred towards any inducement to you to do wrong, but act justly. This will approach nearer to pity and fear God, for God is fully acquainted with what you do." Now, here what they're trying to do is, in these lines, that you could see here, that to observe justice is the prima facie thing that they're talking about. And whenever you witness, as when you appear as a witness, you're witnessing before the God, and God knows everything, so you cannot lie to a God. So this is what was stated in Quran, and everything, the law of evidence was governed by these tenets only. Then if you talk about the next thing, that is uh oh you who believe, be maintainers of justice when you bear witness for God's sake, although it be against yourself or your parents or your near relations, whether the party be rich or poor, for God is competent to deal with them both. So here what they're talking about is that you can give evidence against yourself also. Today we talk about that self-incriminating evidence could not be given, but see, the Quran states it clearly that even if you have to give evidence against yourself or your parents or your near relation, or you will not see whether there is a rich or a poor, you will just state the truth. Therefore, do not follow your low desire in bearing testimony, so that you may serve from justice, so that you may sever from justice. And if you sever or turn aside, then surely God is aware of what you do. See, the genesis or the crux of saying, quoting this portion of Quran is to tell you that the entire, if you talk about ancient India or Hindu period, or if you talk about Muslim period, they were totally based on divine law. That if you do something wrong, and especially under Muslim law, if you do something wrong, that is, you are going against Allah. And Allah is well aware of everything, and you cannot deceive Allah. So it is better you state the truth, and do not follow your low desires, in bearing the testimony. Then I told you, whenever there was any problem, the plaintiff will go to the Qazi who to get the relief for the wrong done, and then Qazi would hear both the parties. Qazi could not give ex parte decree, and at that time also justice was almost free. So this was what about Muslim law, but there were certain witnesses who were incompetent, under Muslim period also, who could not be allowed to give evidence, or those evidences which were not admissible. Now, what were those evidences? Hindus could not give evidences. Why? Because they were non-believer of Quran. So anyone who's non-believer of Quran, or who do not follow Allah, was not admissible, again, for giving evidence against the Muslims. Also, when the person stood in relation to each other, they were considered as incompetent, like son giving evidence in favor of father. So this was not admissible. Then gamblers, drunkards, habitual liars, idiots, professional singer, public mourners, criminals, etc. They were considered incompetent witnesses. Also, a person who was blind, insane, or dumb was considered as incompetent to give evidences. So these were the people who were incompetent under Muslim law to give evidences. Then if we conclude what we've studied so far, under Muslim law, then during the Muslim king and emperor's reign, the Hindu judicial dispute resolution system were intact in the rural areas. During the trial, all substantive procedural law were interpreted according to the tenets of Quran, and the rule of evidence were followed according to the Holy Quran. And who used to follow them? Qazis, because they were the one who were delivering justice mainly. Now, what happened during British India? Now, if you talk about British India, I've told you in the very first slide only that the present act that we talk about is colonial in nature. It was passed by Britishers. Now, Britishers took a lot of steps that we'll be, talking about, and the first step was taken in 1726 to introduce rules containing common law and statute law, which prevailed in England into India through Charter of 1726. So Charter of 1726 introduced the rules that were contained in the statute law, which was prevalent in England. Now, one thing that was there in this charter was while resolving the dispute pertaining to personal law, they followed the evidence laid down in the Shastras and the Holy Quran. For Hindus, it was the Shastras, and for Muslim, it was the Holy Quran. But in all other matters, such as civil and criminal dispute, the English common law was to be followed. This was what was said in Charter of 1726. Then gradually the principle of justice, equity, and good conscience gave priority, and while recording the evidences. Then after justice, equity, good conscience, one thing very important to be noted here was the Code of Cornwallis. Now, when we talk about Muslim period, the Islamic rule of evidence was that two women equal to one man. The two women was equal to one man. So if witness has evidence has to be recorded from a woman, there has to be two women, because two women is equal to one man. Now this concept was discarded by the Cornwallis Code. Then in 1835 also there was an attempt, the first time made an attempt to codify the rule of evidences. And then again in 1837 also it abrogated the rule that a person once convicted could not give evidence. So 1835 there was an attempt to codify the law of evidence. 1837 there was the rule that person once convicted could not give evidence was abrogated, was done away with. Then 1852 there was one more thing added, that parties to civil litigation could be witness to their respective side. So 1835 and 1855, between these periods, there were a lot of enactment, plethora of enactment that was passed during with respect to or touching the law of evidence. And in 1855, all these enactments were consolidated. And if we talk about this particular act, it does not prohibit the adoption of other laws such as rule of English system or the rule of Mohammedan law in Indian code. Now, if we talk about the British India, and before the enactment of the present Evidence Act, there were three important set of rules. Now, what are these three important set of rules? Number one, the set of rules of evidence enacted by different legislatures. Then the set of rules of evidence settled by judicial decision. And then the set of rules of evidence based upon the personal law, customary law, evidence, custom, and usage. So if we talk about the three important set of rules, one was given by the legislature, then by judicial decisions, and then by personal law, customary law of evidence, So these are the, Evidence Act was, divided into three set of laws or three set of rules. One given by legislature, then by judicial decision, and then by personal law, customary law. So as a result, the procedural law were followed in different courts in different ways. So because see, there are different set of law with respect to evidence. So different courts follow different law, and the law became very uncertain, and there were these difficulties were reported to the Privy Council. Now what happened next was that in 1868, Sir Henry Maine, who was the law member of the Governor General Council, were asked to prepare a draft for the Indian Evidence Act. And this draft was submitted to the select committee by the Legislative Council, and there were contradiction between the two members of those committee. Now to resolve those conflict or contradictions, Sir James Stephen succeeded to Mr. Maine as law member of the Legislative Council and brought a brilliant compromise of the two separate reports submitted by the Select Committee and prepared a draft bill which was presented before the Legislative Council in 1871. And now this is the bill that was approved by the Legislative Council, and it received the assent of Governor General of India when on 15th of March 1872, and became the Indian Evidence Act 1872, which came in force on 1st September 1872. And this is the act that is still prevalent in India with some amendment that has been done in past so many years. And I would like to state it very clearly here that before the passing of Indian Evidence Act, this country did not possess any uniform law on the subject of evidence. Also, there were a lot of amendment before the gaining independence. The Indian Evidence Act was amended 11 times, and Sir James Stephens was also regarded as the founding father of the Indian Evidence Act. Now, what happened post-independence? Now, what happened post-independence was there were merger of princely states into Indian Union. So both the substantive and the procedural law had been uniformly applied in all the state, whether British provinces or the native state. Then when the Constitution of India, people of India gave to themselves Constitution of India, and Indian Evidence Act is the law relating to evidence in all the courts in India. And if we talk about Constitution of India, now since people have given this constitution to themselves, and if we talk about constitution, then article 372, which is very important. Now this article basically says that all laws that were enforced in India before commencement of this act, that's this constitution, would continue to be enforced after the adoption of constitution. So this provision made sure that all the laws that applied to different things before would continue to apply. So, and Indian Evidence Act was, as with respect to Article 372 of Constitution of India, was the law relating to evidence in all the courts in India, and it was not amended. It was, continued even after post-independence or post-constitution. Now, talking about after independence, if we talk about the Law Commission in its 69th report has expressed the views about this particular act, and it has said that in the dealing with the problems of making recommendations in the relevant provision of the act, the commission has been fully conscious that the act is very commendable piece of legislation. What did it called? It called it as a commendable piece of legislation. This act has been regarded by teachers of law, jurists, and judges as the model piece of legislation. The scheme of the act and the meticulous and comprehensive manner in which its provision deal with all relevant topics justly entitled it to a place of pride in the statute book of India. So you understand how beautifully the Law Commission has praised the making of Indian Evidence Act. So this act was very important, and beautifully drafted. And if if the Law Commission has said that it enjoys or justly entitled to a place of pride in the Statute Book of India, it is a very huge compliment that Law Commission has given to Indian Evidence Act. Now, this is what was how the Indian Evidence Act has developed. Also, after 1990, there were tremendous or changes due to scientific inventions and revolution in information technology and computers. So there were a lot of amendments, but so through amendments, it has changed and taken shape, different shape, or what it is present, that the law that we see today, it has shaped through all the amendments and everything, seeing the needs of the hour. So this is how Indian evidence law has developed in India. So students, if you have any query with respect to this topic, please feel free to call me or just drop a mail to me or a WhatsApp message, and I will reply to it. Thank you.